This tutorial will discuss the relationship between the lithology and grain size columns in PSICAT. You probably noticed that lithology intervals change width as you add and modify grain size intervals in the same range. This behavior is enabled by default in PSICAT. If you don't want it, you can disable it in the Diagram Options dialog. Diagram Options, look at the lithology columns options and disable the Show Grain Size Widths option here. And when you do that, all lithology options will now draw at full width, and you can skip this tutorial. But if you're interested in continuing, we'll re-enable this. And to help us understand how this all works, we'll also enable the grain size header in the lithology column. So you can see our varying widths are back, and now we have a grain size scale on top of the lithology column. So lithology widths will vary with the corresponding grain sizes. By default, a lithology with no parallel grain size will fill 20% of the lithology column's total width. So that's this sort of blank section here that has no label. If we change this grain size to none, now you can see that this portion of that lithology fills that default section. The remaining 80% of the lithology column will be divided equally by the number of grain sizes in the grain size scale. This project uses the CSD facility default grain size scale, which contains 13 options. So this is split into 13 segments there. You can see the 13 options in the grain size list here. They're sorted from fine clay to the coarsest boulder. And that as we select a grain size, for example, let's just do cobble here. You can see that now this portion of the lithology now aligns with the end of the conglomerate cobble portion of the grain size scale. And lithologies with no adjacent grain size at all will of course just fill the default, which is the same as if we just left it at none. So you have some control over this behavior and how it draws. First, you can control the default width for segments of a lithology interval that have no defined grain size adjacent to them. You can also modify the labels of these grain sizes in the grain size scale. For example, we're getting pretty close to bleeding off the top here. These are a little long, so we could shorten them. You can do both of those things in the Project Grain Size Scale dialog. So first we'll just look at the minimum width. That's pretty easy to see and adjust. As you can see, the current value is 20%. We could change that to 50%. And if we hit OK, now you can see that our none interval down here, we'll make another none interval there. So these have no grain size. Now they're taking up 50% of the available width in the lithology column. So if you want those to be more visible, that is one way to achieve that. The drawback of that, of course, is now that our our grain size scale labels are now kind of compressed and hard to read. So we can adjust that in a few ways. Oops, I have to save this. We can adjust this by, in the lithology column options, we could adjust the font size of grain size labels. We could make this smaller. This will probably help. Definitely more legible, although they are quite a bit smaller now. We could also just make the lithology column wider. So we could make it 350 wide. That should give us plenty of space. We could actually make the font size bigger again and they should fit okay. Oops, come on. There, that looks pretty good. So you may need to make adjustments if you adjust the default width just because the labels will suddenly have less space to operate in. But as always, you can change those options in the diagram options. So to return to the grain size scale dialog now, you can also use that to adjust labels. For example, let's say we don't want the conglomerate. We could just say granule, pebble, cobble, boulder here instead. To edit these, all you do is double click. So we can make this granule, this pebble, cobble, and boulder. Now if I hit OK, you can see suddenly that's taking up a lot less vertical space. So that's how you control these labels. And edits you make in the grain size scale dialog will affect both single section diagrams, both in the live editing view and when you export diagrams that include a grain size scale in the lithology header. It will also affect stratigraphic columns. So unlike some settings that differ between stratigraphic columns and diagrams, for grain size scale, it will be the same for both. So any changes you make here will affect all of your exports and your live diagrams. The grain size scale dialog also allows you to edit grain size widths, but this is not generally recommended. We'll discuss this in a later advanced tutorial, which explains the rather complicated relationship between a project's grain size scheme and the grain size scale. If the CSD facility default grain sizes are sufficient for your work, you shouldn't need to worry about that. So those are the basics of managing interaction between the lithology and grain size columns.